very good afternoon to you and welcome to Lunchtime News, come to you live and direct from the Newsfirst Centre here in Colombo. I'm Florine Rajendran. Before going to the stories in detail, here's a look at the headlines. Indian Prime Minister arrives in Sri Lanka. Prime Minister Modi to address Parliament this evening. Investigations against the corrupt are delayed. An allegation by the JVP. 28 police officers including OICs transferred. On to headline making news, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi arrived in the island at 5:30 this morning as part of his three-nation tour of Indian Ocean island nations. This marks the first time since 1987, after a lapse of 27 years, that an Indian Prime Minister has made an official visit to Sri Lanka. The Indian Prime Minister, who arrived in the island at 5:30 this morning, was extended a warm welcome and was escorted to the Presidential Secretariat in a special motorcade.
இலங்கை நாட்டுக்கான 2 நாள் விஜயத்தை மேற்கொண்டிருக்கிறார்கள். இலங்கை ஜனநாயக சோசலிச குடியரசின் ஜனாதிபதி மைத்ரிபால சிறிசேன அவர்கள் தான் பதவியேற்றதன் பின்னர் தன்னுடைய முதலாவது உத்தியோகபூர்வ வெளிநாட்டு விஜயமாக இந்தியாவுக்கு விஜயம் செய்து இந்திய பிரதம மந்திரியை சந்தித்து அழைப்பு விடுத்த இருந்தமை இந்த ஒற்றுமையின் 28 வருடங்களின் பின்னர் இந்திய பிரதமர் ஒருவர் உத்தியோகபூர்வ விஜயத்தை இலங்கைக்கு மேற்கொண்டு.
The visiting Prime Minister was led to the Presidential Secretariat by a dancing troupe highlighting Sri Lanka's rich culture. The Indian Prime Minister was extended a warm welcome by President Maithripala Sirisena.
Welcomed by His Excellency Maithripala Sirisena, President of the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, and also will be witnessing a guard of honor by the Sri Lankan Navy, followed by a gun salute as well. And thereafter, there will be discussions which will happen inside the Presidential Secretariat. So a very historic day for Sri Lanka and also for the furtherance.
The national anthem was sung following the arrival of the Indian Prime Minister to the Presidential Secretariat. A 19-gun salute was accorded to the Indian Prime Minister, who became the first ever Indian Prime Minister to visit the island after a lapse of 27 years. The State Cabinet and Deputy Ministers were later introduced to the Indian Prime Minister. Bilateral talks to further enhance cooperation and relations between Sri Lanka and India were presided by the President and the Prime Minister of India.
We bid you welcome on this auspicious morning. Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, Modi, Prime Minister of the Republic of India.
Several MOUs were also signed at the occasion. Now, several MOUs were signed between Sri Lanka and India, marking Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the island. Newsfirst Nadim Majid reports with more details.
Two agreements and two memorandums of understanding were signed today between Sri Lanka and India. The first of these was an agreement between the two countries on an exemption from visa requirements for holders of diplomatic and official passports. The agreements were signed by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Sri Lanka and the Foreign Secretary of India, Dr. S. Jaishankar. The second agreement to be signed this morning was an agreement on cooperation and mutual assistance in customs matters. This was signed by the Secretary of the Ministry of Finance, Dr. Samaratunga, and His Excellency Y.K. Sinha, the High Commissioner of India to Sri Lanka. The other two memorandums of understanding that were signed today One was on cooperation in the field of youth development between the Ministry of Youth Affairs of Sri Lanka and the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Sports of India. And finally, an MOU between Sri Lanka and India for the establishment of the Rabindranath Tagore Memorial Auditorium at the University of Ruhuna Matara in Sri Lanka. This was signed by the State Secretary to the State Ministry of Higher Education, Mr. Ranepura, and of course the High Commissioner of India to Sri Lanka, Y.K. Sinha. Those were the 4 agreements that were signed here at the Presidential Secretariat this morning. Of course, from here, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Maithripala Sirisena will be proceeding to the Agrashavaka Mahabodhi Viharya in Malda. This is Nadim Majid, the News First from the Presidential Secretariat.
Well, thank you, Nadim, for that update. President Maithripala Sirisena says that the visit by the Indian Prime Minister had further enhanced relations between the two nations. He made this statement following the inking of a number of MOUs between India and Sri Lanka.
India අතරේ පාත්නා සම්බන්ධතාවය වසර දහස් ගානක දීර්ඝකාලීන සම්බන්ධතාවයක්. The
relations between Sri Lanka and India date back centuries. The arrival of the Indian Prime Minister is a blessing to the government of Sri Lanka and the Sri Lankan people. During the past month, I undertook a visit to India along with several of my ministers. We achieved some good results. The arrival of the Indian Prime Minister has attributed to the further enhancement of bilateral agreements between our countries. The government of India and its people hold high knowledge in terms of technology. They have a number of resources. Sri Lanka is a developing nation. In a competitive society and a competitive world, among the developing countries, the agreements that we reach on obtaining technical knowledge, research and training as well as development of resources is important. Thereby, I once again wish the very best to the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his entourage. I wish to also note that the bilateral relations between our two countries have reached a high level with the arrival of the Indian Prime Minister.
නැවතත් සුබපතනවා වගේම මෙතුමාගේ සම්ප්‍රාප්තිය සමග විශේෂයෙන්ම දෙරට අතරේ වර්තමානයේ තුල සම්බන්ධතාවයන් ද්විපාර්ශ්වික සම්බන්ධතා ඊ타මත්ම උසස් තත්වයකට ප්‍රමුඛත්වයකට ඇති වුණා කියලා සඳහන් කරන්නට පුළුවන්.
We are not just looking at addressing problems. We are also focusing on new opportunities. India stands ready to help Trincomalee become a regional petroleum hub. The Reserve Bank of India and the Central Bank of Sri Lanka have agreed to enter into a currency swap agreement of $1.5 billion US. We discussed the fishermen's issue. This complex issue involves livelihood and humanitarian concerns on both sides. We should handle it from this perspective. At the same time, we need to find a long-term solution to this issue.
Meanwhile, the visiting Indian Prime Minister will address the Parliament this afternoon. Parliament will convene for a special sitting at 3:15 this afternoon. The Deputy General Secretary of the Parliament noted that a special seat next to the Speaker's seat will be allocated for the visiting Prime Minister. The JVP alleges the further delay in investigations continue to strengthen the corrupt individuals. The JVP made this allegation at a public rally in the Valley Khade area in Badulla.
Rogues will be nabbed according to the proper procedure. You can't limit this to mere words and complaints. Once you dial 119, the police arrives, nabs the rogues and keeps them. If you are providing details to the Bribery Commission, the IGP and the Supreme Court, why even after the lapse of 63 days, no one has been nabbed? They say that rogues will be nabbed according to the proper procedure. Rogues are banding together and are being strengthened. Some are not even in the country while others are in hiding. This is wrong. State officials can operate independently. The police can now operate independently. If the independent commissioner, as per the constitution, is established, there will be legal protection for them to operate more independently. How is the situation now? Recruitments and transfers of the police are in the hands of the politicians. It is like they raise them, feed them and make them the OIC. If the OIC is not according to their terms, he is transferred. Politicians have taken over the police. This resulted in the collapse of the law in the country.
On to another one of our headline-making stories. 28 police officers, including OICs and HQIs, have been transferred with immediate effect on service requirements. The police headquarters announced that the transfers were made by the Inspector General of Police. DOIC Samanradapura, Madavashia, Haputale, Pannala, Bulatko, Pitia, Jaila, Kalania, Grandpas, Gampa, Pugoda, Gokarala, Kandy, Mahayangania and Kesalvata have been transferred. Police headquarters also announced that the OICs of Kiriala, Madhyamakandavura, Kurunagala, Padavia, Alpitia, Mount Lavinia, Bandaragama, Gaul and Galagedara too have been transferred. The HQIs of Nikavaratia, Tambutegama and Sitavaka divisions have also been given transfers.